Humans and Healthcare, Using Medical Anthropology to Bridge the Gap Between Homeless Addicts and the Healthcare System, by Stephanie Chen. First of all, what is medical anthropology? Medical anthropology is a subfield of anthropology. That is, it uses all the fields of anthropology, from linguistic anthropology to social-cultural anthropology to biological anthropology, to try to better understand health and how health is affected by a variety of factors. Medical anthropology includes studying illness and how disease spreads, how to treat and prevent illness, the healing process, therapy and mental illness, and how different cultures view and handle issues of health. This is of particular interest to me because I want to be a medical anthropologist and examine the ways culture influences health and how health influences culture. Most of the information in this presentation uses scenarios from the book Righteous Dope Fiend, which was a photoethnography study written and photographed by Philippe Bourgeois and Jeff Schoenberg. Righteous Dope Fiend, as I said, was a photoethnography study of the homeless heroin addicts of the fictional Edgewater Boulevard. So for 12 years, Schoenberg and Bourgeois studied and interviewed these dope fiends and used photographs and moving stories in order to give us access to their life and their struggles. So with medical anthropology, we investigate practices of the body, or how social, economic, and cultural factors influence how people treat their bodies. With the homeless of Edgewater Boulevard, this creates a fascinating situation because their social, economic, and cultural factors are so different from what we consider typical American culture. So some social factors on Edgewater Boulevard were the need to participate in the social life and not be a social outcast. Running partners, groups of probably about 2 men who would collect money in different places by working jobs or panhandling, then pull that money to share drugs, usually had a tight bond. And of course they would share drugs, which is an unhealthy practice because drugs are bad, but they also would do things like share needles and share cottons and participate in the social life by sharing with other people. But sharing needles and sharing cottons have some bad health effects. For example, sharing needles can transfer bloodborne diseases such as HIV and AIDS and hepatitis C. So despite knowing about the risks, the health risks of sharing needles and cottons, the need to participate in the social life was more important. Treatment by other people, for example the police and Caltrans, also harmed the health of the people on Edgewater Boulevard. Bourgeois and Schoenberg described the Edgewater Boulevard homeless as the lumpen of society, the dregs of society, the outcasts who banded together to forge the living that they could. So when Caltrans, for example, would take away their shelter and their blankets, the Edgewater Boulevard homeless suffered. When the police were conducting rounds and doing arrests for drug possession, the Edgewater Boulevard homeless would have to inject in unsafe and unsanitary places, which led to health problems as well. So several social factors affected the practices of the body of the Edgewater Boulevard homeless. Economic factors also affected the Edgewater Boulevard homeless. Participating in the moral economy, again, giving money and sharing needles was dangerous to the health, but also working dangerous jobs was a problem. Max, for example, threw out his back when working for Macon, shoveling sandbags for breakfast and $10 to buy heroin because it was a steady source of income and he knew he could get some dope. And working when sick is also a problem. Both Hank and Petey were ill and in the hospital, and as soon as they got out, they were panhandling in poor weather conditions, which exacerbated their illnesses. But because of the economy of Edgewater Boulevard, the need to buy heroin above all else, and that being the major demand, that created a bad situation health-wise. Hospital economics was also important in Righteous Dope Fiends because the county hospital was going through extreme budget cuts over the 12 years that Bourgeois and Schoenberg were doing their study. For the homeless, they would only go in to get treated when they were very ill and sure that they would be admitted and given methadone, so they wouldn't have to go into dope sickness or withdrawal as they were waiting for treatment, only to be sent out on the street with no money to buy more dope, because they could have spent the day panhandling, but instead they were in the waiting room. So Hogan, for example, was in the hospital with quite a lot of frequency because he had abscesses, and he had a bout of necrotizing fasciitis, and each time they released him before he was truly better, which only made his health deteriorate further. But for the hospital, that was the economics. That was what worked because they had to get people in and out as quickly as possible. However, this was not good for their patients. And finally, cultural factors. The African American cultural practices on Edgewater Boulevard were influenced by the hip hop or OG, original gangsta culture. Instead of muscling like the white culture did, the African Americans would spend a very, very long time trying to find a vein to inject into. Additionally, dope wasn't the drug of choice all the time for African Americans. They were also fond of crack, which was considered a black drug. For white culture, they couldn't take pride in being on the streets as much as the African Americans could, so instead a lot of them pretended to be Vietnam veterans. They would muscle or inject into their fatty tissue, which created problems because they would get abscesses. Now, the benefits of vein injections over muscling is that you don't get abscesses, but vein injections collapse your veins, so that was a health problem the African Americans faced that the whites didn't. However, whites frequently had painful abscesses in which they would go to the county hospital and have them scooped out very painfully, which created another health problem. For white culture, dope was the main drug of choice. However, a lot of them did smoke crack. A lot of the whites in Edgewater Boulevard would smoke crack, but they would refuse to admit to it because of the different cultural practices. Now, what's very, very interesting about Righteous Dope Fiend is that it's a study with photoethnography. So it's not just ethnographers writing down the stories of the people they're living with and interviewing. They take pictures in order to introduce us directly into their world. And for the Edgewater Boulevard homeless, addiction really was their world. I chose this picture of Hank helping Sonny inject himself in the jugular because I feel it is very representative of the addiction on Edgewater Boulevard. It crosses all sorts of racial boundaries. Although there often were conflicts of race, when dope was involved and the addiction was involved, those boundaries are gone. It was who can help me get over my dope sickness right now. Hank was well known for being able to do a vein injection in the neck very, very well, so Sonny would go to him. It also creates a bond between these people. Hank is helping Sonny now with the expectation that Sonny will help him later. This addiction creates a moral economy that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Additionally, I feel like this personalizes Sonny. We see him at a very vulnerable moment, and that vulnerable moment is caused by his addiction. Healthcare access was another portion of the Edgewater Boulevard life that we were allowed to see through the photoethnography. Bourgeois and Schoenberg both described how difficult it was for the homeless to get good healthcare access. It was only when they had extremely life-threatening conditions. This picture is of Hogan in the hospital with necrotizing fasciitis. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. He's hooked up to hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical machinery trying to keep him alive, when if he had come in at the beginning of this disease with an abscess, then he would not have been treated. So it's almost ironic the amount of effort they're putting into keeping him alive here when they couldn't be bothered to do it later. And in fact, when Hogan wakes up from his coma, he is released onto the streets with $10 of cash and a 7-day voucher for a motel. And as soon as that voucher is up, he's back on the streets injecting dope into his skin graft, where he almost lost his left arm. So I chose this picture because I like that irony and how it humanizes Hogan so much, because we hear stories about him being smelly and being nasty and not being the best of people, but here he's just a body in a hospital. And you have to sympathize with that. You have to see this person who is obviously suffering in need of great aid. And it takes the story off the page and into our minds. Another problem the Edgewater Boulevard faced, another struggle that we were allowed to see, was the need to meet basic needs. This picture is of Felix keeping his knee elevated after he was hit by a Pizza Hut delivery truck, or delivery car. And in the background we see his camp, his encampment. This was only temporary. Very soon Caltrans would come and destroy everything and take away the blankets. And yet again, Felix and his friends who were living with him in the camp would be out in the cold with no blankets. And each day was a constant struggle to raise enough money to buy dope, raise enough money to buy food, have enough money to do laundry, to have warm clothing, to have warm blankets. They didn't know whether or not their shelter would still be there when they got back. It was a lot of day-to-day struggles just to meet basic needs. And once again, the photoethnography personalizes the study of these people. It's not just names on a white page, it's their faces, it's the look of pain on Felix's face as he props his leg up under the beam of the bridge because he doesn't have a home, he doesn't have a footstool, he has to do with what he can find. But the purpose of writing Righteous Dope Fiends wasn't just to introduce us into the world of these homeless addicts. There was also a significant portion of the book that was attempting to relate medical practitioners and homeless addicts in an attempt to understand these addicts in order to give them the aid that they needed. With the medical practitioners, a big problem is understanding addiction from both an etic and an emic perspective. From an emic perspective of the medical practitioners, addiction made no sense. These people were throwing their lives away and injuring their bodies for no conceivable purpose. And this made a lot of them justifiably angry. However, if they considered it from an etic perspective, I feel, and Bourgeois and Schoenberg feel, that it would have made the relations between medical practitioners and the addicts better. Because from an etic perspective, the homeless addicts have one goal in mind, and that is to get high and relieve dope sickness. And they will do anything and everything to achieve that goal because that is what is most important to them. Their health falls to the wayside. So, if the Edgewater Boulevard could get treatment and assurance that they wouldn't fall into dope sickness and they would get aid in relieving their dope sickness through the use of methadone, then they would be much more likely to come in and get treatment before things deteriorated too quickly. However, a big problem that the medical practitioners in Righteous Dope Fiends had were remaining professional. There were several horror stories from the emergency room where nurses would ignore the homeless or Hogan had to stay outside so his stench wouldn't annoy the other clients in the waiting room. She yelled at them, she was demeaning, and then even the doctors themselves wouldn't remain professional. There was apparently a surgeon there who, when scooping out an abscess, refused to use pain medication, almost in an attempt to punish the Edgewater Boulevard homeless for their lifestyle. And there was another doctor who didn't want to prescribe pain medication to someone who had just gone through major surgery because she was afraid he would sell it. That was an unprofessional decision because it isn't up to her to refuse someone pain medication just because she's afraid he might sell it. That was a breach of professionality. So something that Bourgeois and Schoenberg tried to describe were the issues with programs that weren't designed for the problem. There was a program on Edgewater Boulevard to try to teach the homeless about hepatitis C and the dangers of sharing needles. However, that wasn't practical because the Edgewater Boulevard homeless would share needles anyway, and most of them already had hepatitis C and there was nothing they could do about it. A program like a needle exchange would actually work much, much better because they could turn in dirty needles for clean needles, which they did want to do, and it made it convenient and safer. Something that Schoenberg and Bourgeois also mentioned was the Swiss program that gave out heroin prescriptions. However, because we're anthropologists looking at different cultures, I highly doubt that the Swiss program of giving heroin prescriptions would work in the United States because of our culture, like the medical practitioners experienced, of wanting to punish addicts for their choices, where it's hard to realize that a lot of these homeless addicts didn't end up there by choice. They were surrounded by this culture from birth, and there was really a very low chance of removing themselves from that culture. So when using medical anthropology, it's not just a objective study, it's also applied anthropology because we're attempting to take a culture and examine its health practices, for example, the Edgewater Boulevard culture and their often dubious health practices, and see what we can do to improve their health practices, not just study them. So Bourgeois and Schoenberg did their 12-year study and came up with several ways to attempt to improve relations between homeless addicts and medical practitioners and improve the lives of homeless addicts in San Francisco. Once again, most of the information in this presentation came from the book Righteous Dope Fiend by Philippe Bourgeois and Jeff Schoenberg. And hopefully I've attempted to explain how medical anthropology can bridge the gap between homeless addicts and the healthcare system. Thank you very much.